So let me begin by saying to you all what a great honor it is to be here this evening and to give a lecture in honor of a very distinguished and courageous young man. Since I live not in the Netherlands but in the United States, I knew very, very little about this before I came. And I've realized since I've been here how important what I gather his name, he's called Frans rather than Johann van Hasselt, did all these years ago. And tonight I'm going to talk about another resistance movement that's urgently needed. It will probably cost any of us who participate in it far, far less than it cost young Frans van Hasselt. I'm going to begin with something that the rector said in his introduction. It was indeed a very hot summer all over the world. This is just a sample of newspaper and magazine headlines indicating the difficulties felt in many regions of the world. And that actually started to persuade some people who had previously doubted the reality of climate change, that it's actually happening. Not all of them believe that we are responsible for it, but thanks to these unusual events of the past summer, less people now deny climate change than used to. That's some sort of progress. And it's registered in a variety of public opinions, some of these go back a couple of years, about what's happening to our planet and what the problem is. So on the left, you see some indications of how public opinion, especially in the United States, has changed. It's getting roughly back to where it was before the recession of 2008. And it's important to realize that what happened in 2008 weakened the realization that climate change is occurring and that it's dangerous, because that's going to be part of the story I'm going to tell. So if you notice, it's also true that in the United States and in many other parts of the English-speaking world, to a lesser extent in the non-English-speaking part of the world, what convinces people is not the evidence assembled by climate scientists patiently over many decades, but rather the fact that it gets hot or unusual storms come along. That, from the climatologist's point of view, is rather poor evidence. They think they can do much better than that, and they have been tracing the footprint in the atmosphere of our own emissions, and extremely successfully and convincingly. But the public around the world, and especially in the English-speaking part of the world, and especially in the United States, seems completely oblivious of this. I have to say that my own country, the country in which I now live, seems to take, or at least its president seems to take, an almost childish glee in contributing to a problem and making it far worse. It's as though Donald Trump wants to accelerate the pace to catastrophe. So what I want to talk about mainly this evening is why our reaction to this has been so slow. What is it that has made climate action so difficult for us? Shouldn't we have realized, and now I quote the mayor's eloquent introduction, that we were going in the wrong moral direction? Well, part of the trouble is that the evidence hasn't gotten across to people. They don't understand what the climate consensus is, and of course they don't really want to believe it, because they know that if they committed themselves to it, it would mean change, and change is uncomfortable. And so they have doubt about the human role in what's happening to our planet, and also doubt about the severity of the threat. So they say things like, well, you know, maybe we're not doing all of it, maybe it'll reverse, maybe it won't get so bad as the scientists say, maybe it won't be as bad, maybe the impact on us won't be as bad. In fact, Europeans, who are among the people likely to get off lightest by the changes in the climate, are probably the people in the world who think most about climate and are most committed to climate action. That's a great compliment to pay to you. You're the ones who won't have to suffer quite as much as the Africans and the Asians, the Americans and the Australians. But there's something else going on, and that's really what I want to talk about. Why was it that reactions to the climate changed in 2008? And the answer is obvious. There was a worldwide financial crisis, and that caused or exacerbated other problems that people already had. And that's the core of my theme tonight. The difficulties in reconciling the demands of the present with the demands of the future. So there is, if you like, the present against the future. Around the world, many people are struggling. They lack basic resources, they lack clean water, they lack food, they lack shelter, they lack access to medical care, they lack personal safety. In many, many, many parts of the world, this is still true, despite the economic progress that has been made in the last century and a half. They are unemployed or underemployed. Many people of the generation that came of age in 2008 find themselves not having the employment opportunities they thought they were going to have. The effects of that financial crisis may be long enduring, and for some of them even permanent. And what's happening? They feel that the education that they receive and the education that is given in their society is woefully inadequate, and that is part of the limits to the prospects for their children. Most people around the world really care about their kids. They really hope that their children are going to have a future that is at least as good as the lives that they have led. And people see, in many societies around the world, symptoms of decline. Things seem to be going backwards, and the prospects for the children seem to be very gloomy indeed. And so when you ask them to make sacrifices, to do things that would bring about a habitable planet for the future, they say, I've got enough problems on my plate right now. There's enough that's difficult and problematic in my own life. Give me a break. Don't make it worse so that I can deal with some nebulous threats to future generations. So where I want to start is with the fact that we do care, at least typically, about the next generation. And I want to ask a very simple question. How far should that care extend? So, concern for the future. You might say that all of us have future friends, right? That there's a person in a later generation whom we care about, who's even of central concern to us. It might be a child, it might be a student, it might be somebody whom you've befriended, whom you expect to live on after you do. And almost in any generation, everybody has somebody they care about who will survive them, who will be a member of the next generation, whose life will extend possibly a long time beyond their own. Now, shouldn't that make a difference then to how we plan for the future? I'm going to give you a very neat, and in the pejorative sense, a clever philosophical argument. Don't worry, it's not meant to convince you. So, suppose we start with our generation and call it Generation Zero. You might say that your life only goes well if the life of your future friend, whoever that is in the next generation, also goes well. And that's also true for future generations. If you now imagine the people in generation number N, their lives will only go well if the lives of their future friends in the next generation go well. I did start my life as a mathematician. And the stage is set for mathematical induction, right? So if your life is to go well, then the lives of all future generations matter to you, right? Because the next one matters, and since the next one, the generation after that matters to the next one, the second one down matters, and then so on and so on and so on and so on and so on. I said it was a clever philosophical argument. It shouldn't convince you, because it's a very familiar kind of argument. Strictly speaking, it's a fallacy. So I am not these days terribly replete with hair. Once I had a lot more hair than I had now, although I have to say there are always signs of bad things to come. But you know, if in my hirsute youth you'd plucked a hair out of my scalp, that wouldn't have turned me from a hairy person into a bald person. Keep going, right? Take one hair out at a time, and there's no stage at which I make that switch. But eventually, sadly, I end up bald. So you can't do this. This is a well-known problem in philosophy called the Sorites problem. And it shows us that our concern for the future is a matter of degree. We care more about the immediate people who come after us than 2 generations down, 3 generations down, and so forth. But I want to suggest that the argument isn't completely wrong. There's something right about that inductive argument I gave you. It may be that the strength of your concern lessens and lessens and lessens and lessens as you look into the distant future. I say to you, 5,000 years from now, do you care about what's happening to people? And you might say, not very much, right? Now, an interesting question is how quickly this actually tails off. How far, you can ask yourself this question, how far as you look into the future does your concern for future generations extend? Now, so far I've just operated psychologically. I've started off from where the people who worry about their own personal problems now and worry about problems for their children are, and I've asked a simple question about how far their psychological concern ought to extend. And it would be interesting to ask psychologists to do experiments and try to find out an answer to this question. But really, the issue isn't how much we do care, but how much we ought to care. So I'm going to turn to the moral or ethical question. How far should our concern for future people extend? Do future people have claims on us that weaken the claims of those who live now? Could it be the case that our obligations to people who will come after us are such that they relieve us of doing some things that we might do for people who live now? This is a very hard question. And I want to suggest that we need to take an impartial perspective across all the generations of our own species. We have to say, look, there will be people after us, and their needs have to be taken care of to some extent. They have to be balanced to some extent against those of present people. It would be wrong to do everything possible to address the many concerns of the present while ignoring the future. That's at least a prima facie plausible view. But equally, it would be wrong to do everything possible to enable future generations to live comfortably while shortchanging the present. And so we have a strict ethical dilemma, and it's actually more complicated than I've portrayed it as being. So let me now turn to its full structure. So the first thing to notice is that the people who are suffering in the present are not simply those in the parts of the world that got left behind by the Industrial Revolution. They're in our midst too. They may not be as visible in Holland as they are in Germany, and they may not be as visible in Germany as they are in the United Kingdom, and they may not be as visible in the United Kingdom as they are in the United States. But poverty and deprivation and hopelessness are found in all of these places. But also, besides inequality within the affluent societies, we have inequality among nations. You have nations around the world who are yearning for development. India, for example, would love to be able to provide electricity on a reliable basis for all its 1 billion citizens. And that's a very serious challenge for that country. And finally, many of the things that we value around the world, of all sorts, institutions, cultural items, things that have been accomplished over centuries of human effort, are expensive and difficult to maintain. Think of this building right here in Delft. Think of Delft itself with its great history and its great beauty. Should we, as it were, let that all go to remedy the problems of suffering and poverty that exist in Holland? Should we let that go to remedy problems of deprivation that exist around the world? So we've got actually a fourfold dilemma. We've got four very important goals that are very hard to achieve simultaneously. We should provide an environment for future generations that won't subject them to severe challenges and hardships. In particular, it seems that we ought to try to prevent the massive deaths of many members of our species due to climate change. We should ameliorate the plight of the citizens in affluent countries who struggle with poverty and deprivation. We should help the nations who have been left behind so far. And we should preserve the accomplishments of the past. You can think about it for the moment as if you had a certain amount of resources and you had 4 pots. And the question is how to divide those resources up properly and fairly among those 4 pots. So how can we approach this dilemma? You might think, well, ethics has been in business for a long time. We have religious approaches to ethics, we have secular approaches to ethics. Can't we apply those to this dilemma? And I think not. And I'm going to be a bit perfunctory about this because I think it's pretty obvious, actually, that these are not going to solve the problem for us. But I'll take you very quickly through why I think that. So which principles ought we to appeal to? Well, we might appeal to a position known as utilitarianism, try to maximize the good or the happiness of the aggregate human happiness. Well, possibly not the greatest human happiness, because there are other sentient beings as well, and maybe we should consider them too. There's egalitarianism. You might think that's a principle that could help us out here, that we should try to provide all humans, present and future, with the same resources or the same opportunities. Even if you accept these principles, and of course they are ethically controversial, it's very difficult to apply them. How do you decide what counts as happiness? Does a particular group of people legislate for all and say this is what happy human lives require, and we should apply that to everybody? Or do we let people choose for themselves? Is in fact choosing for yourself part of human happiness? And how could we possibly compute what would maximize human happiness as we look into a difficult and very uncertain future? And how do we overcome familiar problems that might arise from skewed distributions, where some people have many resources and others have many less? What should we count among the resources that we apportion, whether on the basis of a utilitarian principle or the egalitarian principle? And what kinds of opportunities for people are important? These themselves are ethical questions. So you might say, well, let's take another tack. Let's appeal instead to human rights. Our plans should accommodate fundamental human rights. However we proceed, we should give the people of the future, we should honor their rights, and we should honor the rights of those who are poor in our own society and in other societies. And we should honor these rights in the order of their importance. And here again, that's very difficult to apply. How do you decide on which rights are most fundamental? Which are the ones that need to be satisfied first? Isn't perhaps, you might say, the most fundamental right to a life worth living? But what factors do we count in to making life worth living for people? So I'm going to suggest that we give up on the idea of just looking to some particular text or some particular authority. I'm going to suggest that we're at a moment in our history where we need to start ethical discussion again in a new direction. So as I've said, applying these principles already requires answering some ethical questions. And I want to look in a different place for a method of resolving ethical questions. How is ethical deliberation best done? If we collectively face this fourfold moral dilemma, how should we collectively deliberate together to try to find an answer to it? Now, some people will say, well, you ask experts. You go to your local ethicist or your local rabbi or your local priest or your local sage or your local guru or your favorite text or something like that. People who are good at finding the ethical truth. Now, it's part of my position on this that this is actually a distortion of ethical life, and I shall come to that in a moment. I want to say instead that we have to do this collectively. In the fourfold dilemma that I've put before you, there are a number of different constituencies that need to be heard and whose voices need to be respected and listened to. And so it is impossible, I think, to take any particular source as if it could legislate for all. I think we should resolve this through the best kinds of deliberations and conversations we can manage. And I'm going to give you some suggestions about how those conversations should go. But first, I'm going to suggest that this is part of our human past. So many philosophers think, well, when we think about ethics, we begin with the Greeks. They're the first people who wrote about this. Not strictly true, since there are obvious pre-Greek sources that have lists of moral rules in the first written documents we have, which come from places in Mesopotamia and Egypt. So the Greeks don't really, even in the written record, deserve it. But those early sources of rules that indicate moral life are sufficiently complex that we know there must have been a past behind them. They don't come out of nowhere. The idea of rules and patterns and ideals for human living is already well established 5,000 years ago. And how did we get to that? Well, here are some hypotheses. I think human beings have been engaged in ethical life for 50,000 to 100,000 years. It's what has made us able to live in societies vastly larger than those that our ancestors lived in. Up till about 20,000 years ago, human groups, human societies were very small. Around 20,000 years ago, they started to get together on a temporary basis at first into larger assemblages. By 8,000 years ago, people were living in cities of 1,000. By 5,000 years ago, they were writing down laws and rules for conduct. What you see here is an evolutionary process that grows out of a life that is no longer simply run by the dispositions and characteristics and impulses of human animals, but conforms to something that we might think of as a system of rules, principles, norms, patterns of behavior. Now, where did that start? My second hypothesis is that ethical life originally arose because of the social tensions generated from our limited responsiveness to others. We are a very unusual species in that the form of our society has always been a very peculiar one. We've always lived in societies that are mixed by age and sex. Most animal species can't manage that. Chimpanzees and bonobos can. And they can do it because they have a psychological adaptation. They can recognize what fellow members of their group are trying to do, and they're sometimes able to respond to that by doing things that either are mutually beneficial or that aid the other individual. Call that a capacity for responsiveness. Our ancestors had it. It enabled them to live in this special, demanding kind of society. The only trouble was, as we know from observations of primates like chimpanzees and bonobos, it didn't work smoothly. We might have remained in that evolutionary cul-de-sac, that dead end, but we didn't. We found ways to get beyond that, to enlarge group size, to start trading with our neighbors, that was already established by about 25,000 years ago. We invented a system of rules to guide our conduct. That's ethical life, and it transformed us. It made us the people we are today. That is, I think, part of the evolutionary story. And the fundamental problems that arose from our lack of, or limited responsiveness, I should say, to those around us, were tackled, I think, third hypothesis, in the way that contemporary hunter-gatherers tackled them. They sit down together at the end of the day in what David Hume famously called the cool hour, and they try to work through issues on conditions of equality and to try to find a solution with which everybody can manage to live. Now, I suggest that this understanding of where our ethical life comes from is actually valuable at our present moment, because we've lost sight of this kind of interaction and reflection that might help us move forward with our dilemma. We've gone in a different direction. And we've been subject to what I think of as a harmful distortion. There is a problem that must have been faced by our ancestors 50,000 or 40,000 or 30,000 years ago, which is, how do you get people to be motivated to comply with the rules you've agreed on when they're no longer visible? I sneak off into the bush and I'm out of sight. A taboo animal comes by and I think, nobody's watching, I'll grab it and eat it. Why don't I do that? What motivates me? Well, there is a solution which anthropologists have documented in societies all around the world. You're always under observation. But you're not under observation by your fellows, are you? Well, you might think there's somebody up there looking down on you. And if you break the rules, not only you, but your group will get punished. It's an incredibly powerful theme in group life around the world, of under all sorts of conditions. And that then allows people in the cool hour at some moment to say, you may be proposing this, but I know what the source wants. Perhaps there's a bit of frothing at the mouth and falling on the ground and some dramatic gestures and gesticulations, and the shaman is born. And now what has happened? Instead of the collective, authority has been transferred to a single individual. And even though it's more benign today when you've got a thoughtful ethicist writing a book, it's still the same thing, and it's still a distortion. So the expert overrides democratic discussion. So this is a plea to you. Let's bring democratic discussion back again and make it the core of our response to our ethical dilemma. Now, you might think I have an unlikely ally here. This is a famous Brexiteer, Michael Gove, who said, "I think that the people of this country, the United Kingdom, have had enough of experts." I do think there's a place for experts. I think people trained in philosophy, like my colleagues here, are particularly good at helping this conversation to go well. I think they supply resources that can be used in the conversation. I don't think they have final authority, but they are, like Socrates, the midwives of good deliberative discussion. They are the sort of the heirs of Socrates among us, the people we need not pronouncing, but helping us all move things forward and making sure that the conditions for a good discussion are met. And so I offer you an approach to ethics which is founded in the idea of an ethical method. I'll call it contractualism, although the word has been used in different senses by others. So I think ethical questions are ideally resolved by ideal conversation. Conversations that meet three conditions. First of all, inclusion. You have to bring in all the parties affected by the question. They all have to have space at the table. They all have to have a say. That may mean that you, if you're going to be practical about this, that you have to gloss over differences. You have to lump people together who might disagree with one another on things. But you have to do the best you can to represent all, as it were, the major points of view. The next thing is, you don't let people get away with nonsense. When, for example, the president sits down at the table and starts going on full of falsehoods, you don't let him get away with it. The philosopher who is moderating the discussion says, no, you have no evidence for that. In fact, the evidence runs contrary to that. You have to retract that claim. And if he's sufficiently obstreperous, you have to kick him out of the conversation. You have to get somebody else to represent the position who will, as it were, play fairly in terms of the things that we know. The third thing, and perhaps the most important thing, derives from my diagnosis of how ethical life got started. If I'm right, ethical life began because we have this capacity for responding to one another, and it's limited. The thing about the cool hour, when we sit down together, is that we are in a better position to respond to one another and to engage with one another. And so I call this the condition of mutual engagement. We try to understand one another's perspectives, modify our own perspectives as we learn about the perspectives of others, and try to find our way to a solution that all can accept. Not necessarily a solution that all rank as the best, but one that all can accept. So that is the core of what I think the correct way of going on with our moral deliberation is, and it's the core of what I think of as moral methodology. But this shouldn't be read in a utopian way. If we think about applying this to our fourfold dilemma, and we see the parties who come into conversation, first of all, representatives of the future generations who can't speak for themselves. Secondly, representatives of the people who are suffering in affluent societies today. Thirdly, people from different countries around the world where the standard of living is low and economic development is yearned for. And finally, people who represent the things that have been accomplished on various fronts in the past. And these people, with their various constituencies, have to come to the discussion together, and they have to try to work together to balance the budget that we can allot among our four pots. That's the guiding thought here. Now, I want to say we couldn't possibly do that in a realistic way. We can't assemble all the constituencies from around the world. But ideals are useful things, not because we strive to achieve them, but because they point out the problems and defects in our present situation, and they give us ideas for going on and making progress from where we are. And so, we should try to improve the discussions that we have with respect to this fourfold dilemma. We should make them more inclusive, better informed, and above all, more engaged. Really try for understanding what it is that makes people in poor countries say, to hell with it, I'm going to use soft coal, even though I know it's got terrible carbon emissions, because we have suffered long enough with a substandard way of organizing our economy. We've been unproductive. We haven't been able to give medical care. To hell with it. We've got to understand what prompts that reaction and try to come to terms with it and meet it and satisfy the genuine demands that lie behind it. Now, I'm now going to step back and say some much more concrete things about where we are with respect to this dilemma. So I'm switching now, having given you the ethical framework, I'm going to stand back and try to think about ways in which it might not be appropriate to use that with respect to the climate change problem, and how we might go further in implementing it. So first of all, some criticism. Economists sometimes say, look, this sort of discussion, this ethical discussion of what we owe to the future is actually pointless. Because in fact, the dilemma that we face is at best addressed by forgetting about mitigation, that is, making the climate of the future better than it would otherwise be. Just don't worry about it. The best gift contemporary human beings can offer to future generations is the largest possible set of resources for adaptation, and that can be achieved by not tampering with productivity and economic growth. Some economists are very keen on emphasizing the fact that in the last 150 to 200 years, there has been a tremendous upsurge in global productivity. And so they say, just let it roar. And then the future people, they'll have all of these resources, they'll have all these technologies, they'll know what to do with it, they can deal with the threats as they arise. And this often comes in graphical form. So there at the top you see, first of all in the United States and then in a number of countries, the ways in which productivity has gone up. But what I really want to draw your attention to is the bottom slide. This comes from a presentation that made the argument I've just given you. So the curve that goes up in the red is the curve that would show economic growth if we did nothing at all about climate change. And then there's the small emission reduction, medium emission reduction, and large emission reduction, and then which represents what happens if climate activists really get going and try to do something serious about the future. Notice it's not just that it doesn't go up as fast, it actually drops off. It's terrible. Terrible, say the economists, so you can cross off the idea of doing anything about the future. But that extrapolation is completely unwarranted. The red line in the last slide is pure and utter guesswork. Why? Well, some economists would say because actually we're already seeing a flattening out, that the phase of economic growth of the last 150 to 200 years that we've been going through is actually very unusual, and it can't last. But I won't argue that point. That's a dispute among two schools of economists. The far more elementary point is that the red line takes no account at all of the shocks and disruptions to the global economy that are caused by climate change. It just says, well, it's not going to happen. It's pure denialism in a new form. Economics is going to be unaffected by the ways in which, cities are destroyed and medical resources have to be rushed into various places, and floods happen and droughts happen and agricultural production is disrupted. None of that is going to affect the economic growth. And that is pure guesswork. And these are likely to be enormous unless mitigating steps are taken. Now, why do I say that? Do I have a basis for saying that? First of all, let me recognize an insight in the economic critique. Doing things to prevent the future climate from being really harsh, that is, mitigating it, will disrupt many aspects of people's lives. We really don't know how severe the shocks will be if certain kinds of mitigating action are tried, and nor do we know how severe those shocks are going to be if we continue business as usual. We are in a position of radical uncertainty here. And this is a very important thing to realize, because this is part of the reason why climate action is so hard. Because we cannot sit down and say, well, we've got a plausible plan for doing it. There's so much that we don't know about the future. So I'm going to come in a moment to trying to figure out how we cope with that. We do know some things. That if nothing is done, the Earth's average temperature is likely to be between 2 and 7 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels by 2100. Those are figures that represent the respectable outer bounds. Extreme optimists think that even with no climate action, the temperature might still remain at about 2 degrees Celsius above in pre-industrial levels. Some people think that it will go higher than 7 degrees, but they're typically regarded as fringe. The 2 to 7 range is the usual range that is given. But if business continues as usual, it will be more than 5 degrees above pre-industrial levels sooner or later, right? There's nothing magical about 2100. I mean, you see this all the time in literature on climate change. How much hotter will it get by 2100? Does it really matter if we hit the 5-degree mark in 2100, or whether we hit it in 2128, or 2147, or 2163? It will most probably be sometime in the next century. That is a fairly conservative consensus climate projection. And that is really scary. It's really scary because of this diagram, which I don't know if you can see, but all you need to do is see the shape of the top line. So this is degrees above pre-industrial levels. And this point, this is misleading in that as you go down here, you go into the deeper parts. So these are years or millions of years before the present. And so you've got a very high period here, where it goes up to about 7 degrees above the pre-industrial temperature. And in this region here, it's 5 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures. So what does 5 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures mean? It means that there's never any ice on the Earth's surface, and it means that you get tropical reptiles like crocodiles and alligators around the poles. This is a world in which the places where most of the human population lives, parts of Africa, parts of Asia, become not just unpleasant, but physiologically impossible for people to be outside working. So, this is a world in which a large part of the human population is either going to have to have migrated already, or it's going to die out. So I suggest, given that we don't know so much, there's so much that we don't know about this, that we deal with uncertainty pragmatically. So let me ask you a very simple question. Suppose you were lost without a map in a dark and dangerous forest with nightfall coming on and alarming noises coming from among the trees. What would you do? You wouldn't just stand still and hope for the best, right? you'd probably look and see if there was a direction in which you could see light between the trees. And you would strike out in that direction, and you would be prepared to adjust as you went along. Look for some possible way out, adjust your course as you go. And our best chance, I think, is to emulate that with respect to climate change. So, how do you do that? Well, if there were lots of us, and we could all communicate with one another and rally on the best-looking option, right? The problem of getting out of the forest would be much easier. So the rector goes in one direction, the mayor goes in another direction, Jeroen goes in another direction, I go in another direction. And we call out to one another, yes, it's looking very promising over here. Come along, and then we split up again and try various variants along that, and we increase our chances that way. So what's the analog of that for the climate change case? Well, we do various kinds of experiments to see what will work in two different senses. Will it reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases that are needed, that the reduction is needed to keep the Earth's temperature in a reasonable range? And can people live with it? So I began by talking about principles and fundamental rights and human happiness. And there's a sense in which that has to be put to the test. So I'm suggesting an experimental development of this deliberative method. Try a number of things, see what people can live with, and see what reduces emissions, and then try to get everybody on board with that, and then take the next step, experimental steps, and keep going. And with luck, you'll find a way out. So we need global social experimentation, different nations trying different experiments, distributing information about successes and failures, and the citizens and the nations, who are the laboratory animals in this process, need to be protected. You can't just sort of launch your subjects into experiments and not care about them when they are human beings. And so you need networks of social support. You can see where this is going. It's going towards international democracy. It requires phasing out the thought that one nation comes first. Let's make America great again. Well, let's make the world habitable first. And part of doing that requires us to work together and not to treat one another as competitors who are best stomped out. And that has to be replacing with systematic cooperation. And all of this has to be moderated by the kind of ethical deliberation that I've been talking about and recommending. And now we come to the really gloomy part of this talk, because this is the moment at which I have to urge, especially the younger people who are here, to stand up and engage in climate action for your own sakes and the sakes of those who will come after you. We live at a very dangerous time. Is there any hope that a program along these lines could succeed? So first of all, many people are skeptical about climate change, its causes and its impact. Many nations retreat from international cooperation and withdraw from larger unions. Trump has said he will withdraw from the Paris climate agreements. Brexit has happened. I hope it can be reversed. Countries want to split up. They don't want to unite. And the causes of trouble for this are clear. In the climate situation, different questions get run together. When people are considering whether it's real and how bad it will be, they start thinking immediately about what the consequences are for them and for their lives, instead of taking the questions systematically in order, proceeding in a deliberative fashion. Rampant misinformation, it goes on. I don't know the extent to which this is true of Dutch newspapers. I don't read Dutch, so I can't tell, but this is certainly true for the English-speaking world. It's less true for the French, and it's less true for the Germans, although none of these media are perfect. It comes as a result of populism, pushing individual nations to retreat from the international stage. That itself is fueled by a mix of resentment and nostalgia, and by a growing tolerance for what can only be called bullshit. It's natural to dismiss people like Gove when he talks about not wanting experts, or Donald Trump as liars. They're not liars. They're bullshitters. They don't intend to tell falsehoods. They just don't care about whether it's true or not. I mean, if it's true, if it's false, it doesn't matter. Evidence doesn't matter. Words become tools for these people to be used in political battles. They are not describing the world, they are provoking an audience. This is a terrible phenomenon of current life. And so, can we fight back against that? Well, I think we need a deepening as well as an enlargement of democracy, and I'm going to end by telling you what I think democracy is and then thinking about the prospects for it. So democracy requires more than votes and elections. It's superficial manifestations of democracy when people go to the polls and they vote for more than one candidate. You have to have more than one candidate. It doesn't count as a democracy if you just got one. But even that is very superficial, because it makes no impact on their freedom if they go to the polls and they're misinformed. If in the act that is supposed to, as it were, exercise their voice, their choice, they vote for the wrong people because they haven't got a clue where their interests lie. But even that, which we might call million democracy after John Stuart Mill, isn't sufficient. Deep democracy requires the kind of serious exchange that I've seen as central to ethical method. It requires people engaging with one another at a very deep level, coming together and trying for mutual understanding and mutual satisfaction. And so, in the book that Evelyn Fox Keller, very distinguished historian and philosopher of science, and I wrote together on the climate change issue, we proposed that the best way to start this is with a grassroots movement. Start small, get people who disagree with one another but have some respect for one another, who are neighbors, to start talking, working things out together, and hope that this will snowball into something bigger. It's happened once or twice. It happened in the AIDS crisis of the 80s. It happened in the opposition to the Vietnam War, for those of us who can remember that. Could it happen again? Well, I hope so. But if you ask me whether I'm very confident, I'm not. And we desperately need at this moment a renewed call for climate action. Because if this doesn't work, a technological solution is the only hope. Not a geoengineering that produces an atmospheric state in which people have never lived. Let's throw a few sulfur particles into the atmosphere and see what happens. Our track record of ecological experiments is not, shall we say, encouraging. And we just have one atmosphere to play with. Geoengineering that returns us to a previous state about which we know. So we reduce the carbon in the atmosphere to a level that will get us back to pre-industrial temperatures, maybe 1 degree, 1.5 degrees above, by producing the great carbon-sucking atmospheric vacuum cleaner that takes it all out of the sky and buries it conveniently somewhere. Well, maybe TU Delft will give us that. Wouldn't it be lovely if that would have happened? But I'm going to end with a poem, and it's a poem by a Scotch-Irish poet whom you may or may not know, Louis MacNeice, who wrote in the 1930s. And he wrote about a challenge that he saw in the 1930s that he thought callous and careless and superficial people were ignoring. And I think of this when I think of Franz von Hasselt's resistance to that terrible threat, the threat of Nazism, and what distinguishes him from the people who went along. So, it's no go, my honey love, it's no go, my poppet. Work your hands from day to day, the winds will blow the profit. The glass is falling hour by hour, the glass will fall forever. But if you break the bloody glass, you won't hold up the weather. The challenge we face today is even greater than the challenge to which Franz von Hasselt responded, and we need to act now. Thank you very much.